to use is CBSA 410. We meet our next, as always, there at CNBC Africa for the channel, at Fifi Peters for me, and you can drop us a WhatsApp as well. But let's start off with the car market, the car industry here in South Africa, given the Auto Week being wrapped up today. And you remember that the Auto Week this time happening as the industry does find itself on a much firmer path and firmer footing compared to a year ago, as evidenced by the latest new vehicle sales data that put new car sales at a 10-year high and well past the lows of the COVID-19 pandemic. To discuss the key outcomes of Auto Week and the state of the industry at large, I am joined by Renai Moothilal, the CEO of the National Association of Automotive Components and Allied Manufacturers. Renai, thanks so much for your time. Am I right in assuming that sentiment was a lot more positive this year and this time around amongst yourselves and amongst your colleagues, just given the data that is showing quite a firm state for the car market, as it were?
Fifi, thanks for having me. Let me start off by commending my colleagues at NAACAM for putting together the events of the past few days. I do think it has come at a time where the South African manufacturing sector, particularly in terms of autos, has been at sort of an inflection point. But let's kick off where you kind of pointed us towards. It is positive that we are seeing a recovery in domestic vehicle sales in South Africa. I think the most recent numbers showing year-to-date 14% increase. Yeah, positive. Domestic market growing on the back of some of the good things happening in a wider macroeconomic context, interest rates on a downward curve, inflation easing off as well. Having said that, yes, sales increasing, but I think from a manufacturing perspective, what we have seen is a greater capture of domestic market by imported vehicles. I think for the year under review, there's been a 30% increase versus the same time last year in terms of imported vehicles. So I think a muted positive outcome to some extent. From the manufacturing value chain perspective, we would love to see more domestically produced vehicles sold into the domestic market. And from particularly the area in which NAACAM works, greater supply of domestically produced components into those lines.
Yeah, I suppose maybe a question around fleshing out the greater impact on the local manufacturing industry as a result of, I don't know if we're calling them disruptors anymore, just given the fact that it looks like they've found themselves a very comfortable parking space in the car market. And in fact, they keep on taking up a lot more booths or parking areas, as it were. But what has been the fallout of the increase in imported goods in South Africa?
Yeah, I think, look, South Africa has always been a market that has been a balance of imported vehicles and locally produced vehicles. If we look back to the start of what we know as the APDP period, which is probably about 12 years ago, you had a roughly 50-50 balance in those two categories. What we are seeing now is closer to 65% penetration of imported vehicles. Look, it's great for consumers in that you've got the range, but I think as South Africans, we've also got a responsibility in wider economic outcomes, and that includes trying to make a dent on some of our issues around unemployment. And it really is the manufacturing side of the automotive sector which is going to be able to assist in that regard. So in terms of an impact, greater sales of domestically or imported vehicles on our domestic roads is not great for manufacturing. It replaces vehicles that are making use of domestic components, and it's a component sector where we're really going to see more of those economic outcomes. So what we are looking for, and I think this was very clearly articulated across several sessions by key stakeholders at the Auto Week, including Minister Tau, my colleague at naamsa, the General Secretary Ivan Jim, who were very clear that we've got to look at some of the policy tweaks or changes that are needed fairly quickly that allows South African-based assemblers to start selling greater product into the the local market. And in some extent, we've seen, if you look at what happened with the US and the tariff situation globally, yes, we've got a sector that has always kind of in the last 10 years or so been focused on the export market. But Trump sneezes and big exporting countries like South Africa catch a cold. So I do think we will see some movement around policies that could assist greater capture of the domestic market, and then linked to that, trying to stimulate greater local production of components.
Sure. I'm wondering whether those policies could include a potential taking a page out of Trump's playbook himself in terms of how he's tried to get a whole lot of industries manufacturing a lot more in the US, i.e. tariffs. And I mean, what that could potentially look like if it's an initiative that South Africa were to drive.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a real consideration, and it's not too different from what's happening in other parts of the world. All countries are looking to find ways of protecting or stimulating their own domestic manufacturing sector. I do think South Africa has some place or some space to play in terms of our WTO requirements. We are below the threshold of what we can be in terms of what is determined a fair tariff for South Africa. But we should not be scared of the word tariffs. I mean, South Africa's had tariffs for vehicles for pretty much the post-democratic era. What we have is an APDP, or government support program, which is a import-export kind of duty credit program where manufacturers are incentivized to produce in South Africa, localize components in South Africa, and then use those credits to offset whatever the tariffs or the duty obligations are with SARS. So I do think, yes, we've got some space to play with that, but there's other ways. I mean, what we should also very proactively be doing is looking to aid some of those brands that are selling at high volume in South Africa to develop their own production plans, whether it's the form of domestic vehicle production or finding ways of increasing their own exports of components from South Africa into some of the global plants. There's a way to make them strong contributors to our own automotive economy.
Yeah, which leads me to my next question. In terms of your conversations with some of these manufacturers who currently aren't perhaps doing as much in the country as they possibly could, when they ask or answer that question as to what should be done to encourage a lot more manufacturing by their brands in SA, what are some of the asks that could encourage that behavior?
Look, I mean, there's, of course, South Africa has a fairly advanced and long-standing history of incentives. And, of course, they would look to set up deep or CKD manufacturing plants to take advantage of those incentives. And that's a really big attraction point. But some of them as well in these kind of conversations say, hey, you know what, if we are to manufacture in South Africa, we would like to ensure we participating quite strongly on the domestic market. So even themselves are thinking that if there are protection measures for products that are assembled in South Africa, that's to their advantage. So it's not necessarily that these imported brands are all totally against additional tariffs. If they've got business plans to manufacture in South Africa, tariff ends up being a pseudo incentive of its own.
Yeah. What about incumbents and the existing sort of known brands? Renai, what are some of the things that stood out for you in terms of them? I mean, I do know that this week we were also looking at some of the job cuts that were facing some workers over at one of the manufacturers, Ford, one of the key ones here in South Africa. But I'm just wondering what is in the pipeline, but some of the incumbents that could have a positive or perhaps even a negative effect on the local manufacturing industry.
Yeah, I think it has been a tough time for not just Ford. We've seen over the last 2 years, I think about 5 out of the 7 OEMs having some level of volume reduction, job reduction. So Ford is obviously the most recent example, but it's not a kind of singular phenomenon. And they themselves are equally saying to stakeholders, to partners in government, that, hey, we need to relook at what are the policies that have caused us to lose significant volume within the domestic market, because we're losing sales on the domestic market, and that ends up showing in terms of our production volumes. So they themselves are saying, we maybe need to rethink the way things have been done for a very long time, because there have been certain unintended outcomes of the way the APDP has been implemented. And maybe it's time for a recalibration. So I do think the incumbents are in favor of some of the changes that give them a level of protection on the domestic market, and also looking to shore up. I do think one of the key things that we're going to have to be doing as a country, in particular in the automotive space, in the immediate future, is being very deliberate about expanding that export base, which we know there's certain traditional markets that are starting to close. We need to leverage on the other strong ones, the EU, for example, and unpack or unlock the opportunity that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement brings, and then start to look at other value chains that capture a greater amount of manufacturing here in South Africa or the region. There's a fair amount of regional partnerships in terms of critical minerals and the like that introduce levels of competitiveness to any assembler, especially those that are here. All of that are issues that are being very seriously discussed right now, and to see how quickly we can package and get some of that recalibration done.
Sure. So I'm glad that you mentioned critical minerals. It's a little bit of an out-the-box question regarding pricing. I mean, we continue to talk about the new highs and the strong performance of commodity prices right now. We continue to hear that across the world over, the popularity of hybrid vehicles are increasing, and that is what is pushing some metal prices higher, like the likes of platinum and the PGM groups. And I'm just wondering if we, as motorists, should be expecting any sort of increase as a result of what is happening with commodities right now, by way of what we do pay for the new cars that are manufactured, or even car parts that we need for our existing vehicles.
I don't think there's an immediate impact in terms of pricing, if any particular commodity in the vehicles manufacturing chain changes, because OEM planning tends to smooth out that kind of exposure to changes in commodity prices. So, okay. So pricing of vehicles not necessarily linked to an individual commodity requirement. I do want to maybe close on a point. We'll just expand on this issue of the PGMs and hybrids. Like, I think it's a positive for South Africa. And the fact that hybrids are on the upward trend that you've referred to, the fact that battery electric vehicle has not panned out the way people thought maybe 2-3 years ago, means that South Africa remains well positioned to increase the kind of volumes of products that come out of South Africa. We've already got established vehicle manufacturers playing in the hybrid space. We've long had strength in the field of emissions controls or catalytic converters, which are the biggest consumer of PGM. And the fact that we've got that domestic source means that those two outcomes should talk even closer together. And I don't want to use the word mop up, but let me say really try and pull as much volume in that hybrid ICE market as we can in the short term, as we transition the country's manufacturing base to whatever the suitable technology is in the near future.
Sure. No, thanks so much for that perspective, Renai. A week full of positives, it would seem, and some concerns for your industry, given what is going on by way of the disruptors that you did speak about. But we'll leave it there for now, sir, and have a great weekend. Renai Moothilal, CEO at the National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers, taking us to our first break. When we return, we just get a market's perspective on the month